welcome this afternoon. It's quite a big subject. Last time I spoke here was 2 weeks ago on Islam. That was big enough. This is sort of even bigger, archaeology. One of the problems with archaeology is it keeps changing. You know, there are certain things which become, if you like, set in stone, then there's some things which are uncertain, and then new discoveries are made, and so it's continual changing all the time. And of course, one of the things depends on the archaeologist's interpretation. I mean, we all have our own world view, and when I read the literature and that, I find that there's some archaeologists who don't believe the Bible, and therefore it can't be biblically, can't be true. And so there's already a certain amount of skepticism underneath. So it depends on the authority you read as to what you can believe. And part of the problem is, of course, when things are discovered, they're often in different language. And so therefore, does this mean this is the same place as this place? The Hebrew name in the Bible, is it the same place? And often, of course, you'll get cities built on cities, and later on you'll see one where there's 5 layers of archaeology, and each one is a different period. Because one of the things is that there's a huge amount of lots of stuff out there. Unfortunately, an enormous amount of material has been lost. For example, the library in Alexandria held over 1 million volumes, and that was all lost in a 7th century fire. So, you know, in spite of that, there's only a fraction of the available archaeological sites that have actually been investigated. And even then, only a fraction of each site has been investigated. So we're looking at something which is exploding, and the reason why it's exploding is because of the technology we have, and I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. One of the things, of course, is that there are lots and lots of findings which support the historical background, the events of the Bible. And many times people believe the Old Testament was wrong, and eventually something turned up to say, yes, it is correct after all. And my aim in this talk is to highlight just a few things I've personally found interesting. Now discussion time, if you've got some things to share that you've found out about archaeology, it would be great to let us know. Because I'm going to cover all of them, I just picked a few, and this talk won't be a short one, I'll warn you that now, so don't fall asleep yet. And of course, some of the things that were thought to be impossible have now realised are possible. And this focuses me on 2 things about the impact of archaeology on the Bible. First of all, it can confirm events and people in the Bible itself. But secondly, it also confirms the sorts of things that are going on in other cultures, which are typical of what's happened with the Jewish culture. So that, you know, they may say, well, the Jews can't be doing that, it's too advanced. Then you find that a corresponding culture is doing that. And so there's confirmation also coming from outside, as well as from confirmation with the Bible itself. And of course, you know, some of these societies have got the ancient Egyptian, Hittite, Canaanite, Assyrian and Babylonian cultures. And all of these provide information which have parallel accounts which relate to the Old Testament. For example, nothing was known of the Hittites for some time outside the Bible. But since then they've uncovered 5 temples. And the ceremonies described in the Jewish Pentateuch are consistent with the ceremonies of the cultures of this time and period, and not too complicated. So anyway, the first thing I'm going to look at, now, the number of things that we find now, there's a lot of cheaper equipment now, and of course electronic stuff's coming down all the time. You can buy TVs and DVDs for a lot less. Well, the same is happening with quite sophisticated equipment. And of course everything's now sort of wireless, Wi-Fi. The second thing is that these days we can handle very large amounts of data, like billions of observations. And there are a lot of big data set collections. There's a whole lot of those, I won't go into that. Also too, we have 3D imaging. So that, for example, you can get 3D cards for your TV and for computers, which give very high definition and stereo. For example, in the dentist, you go to the dentist these days, they can make a crown. They just wander around with something and take sort of spot positions on this tooth, and then this my dentist does anyway, I don't know about your dentist, but he goes away and then next minute the machine's going and he comes out with a crown and sticks it on top. So you can do a lot of things with 3D, and of course with 3D printers, you can make virtually anything these days. We need some more chairs, Andrew. Everybody seems to want to know about what's under the ground. You're welcome. I'm sorry that we need some more chairs. They're coming. The other thing too, of course, is a lot of instruments are now solar powered. I've got a hand calculator, which I actually use from time to time. It's solar powered, and I've got a torch which is solar powered as well. So eventually one day I'll become solar powered too. That'll be good. Then we have very high definition digital cameras, which can take something like 5,000 to 10,000 artifact photos each season, and they use a system called structure from motion to create a rapid 3D construction of sites using only photographed images. So you can use the camera to construct three-dimensional pictures. And of course we've got some very good GPS systems now. You can have one which is fixed and one which is roving. And the roving one wanders around and takes coordinates and that. But when you combine it with the fixed one, they can get down to 1 inch accuracy, which is incredible. Then, of course, you've got an electronic distance measurer. Of course, these days, you know, if you want somebody to come and measure carpet, they've got a laser one. They'll put it and say, oh, yes, that's the distance. And so you can get a lot of things now through laser type technology. Well, there's a thing called electronic distance measurer. It's called a total station. And what it does is it takes 3D coordinates and also the slopes from the instrument itself. So you can actually work out everything and reproduce it. Anyway, they've got these handheld X-ray fluorescent analyzer. You get all that? And you can detect and quantify elements from a sample. So the thing about it's handheld. We've got lots of handheld instruments now, but before we need to be sent away to the lab. And so you can work out what's in from a sample. You can work out what's in it. Then you've got another one called a handheld Fourier transform infrared spectrometer. And what it does, it bounces light off things, and from that you can tell what's in the substance. And then you've also got high precision high precision dating with radioactive carbon. And there are two methods which you use, and one of them now which is much better. There's one that used to be called radiometric dating, right? And that wasn't so accurate. You needed quite a big amount of substance, like maybe 10 milligrams. Now you can use what's called accelerated mass spectrometry. And you can get down to 1,000th of the size, a very, very tiny amount, and you can analyse it. And it's much quicker. It's hours rather than days. And it does actually involve statistical methods. Well, I won't go there. I won't want to be bored by statistics. But you can get down to plus or minus 20 years. So that's very accurate radioactive dating. And of course, portable ones are coming out. They're just sort of coming out now, I've noticed. And then finally, we've got drones. I'm not quite in that category yet, but drones and helium balloons for aerial photos. We can actually do 3D stuff again and mapping. And then also too, we've got ground penetrating radar, which means that you can look into the ground, sometimes down to as much as 4 or 5 meters, and see what's under the ground. It depends, of course, on the topsoil. I think the soil that I have in my place, it probably wouldn't get more than a few inches, by the hardness. Anyway, the thing about this is a non-destructive method. It means you can do a lot of these things without destroying the site or affecting it. And it uses electromagnetic radiation. And of course what they've done is they've found things like burial trenches and buried metal structures using this sort of thing. And then finally, I've just mentioned briefly that we have better techniques for investigating papyrus. One of the problems is that you can actually buy quite ancient papyrus available, and forgers can access this. And so there are a lot of sort of pseudo stuff that's been floating around, but they have tools now which enable them to check out and also like aging, and if the chemical composition of the ink is right, and so on. So that's just a quick skirt through, but it shows you how much is changing, and this is going to make a huge impact over the next 10 years. There'll be a lot of stuff coming on. It's coming on all the time. What's interesting, for example, when I mentioned that we get information from things associated with the Bible, for example, you've got one of them was a place called Ashkelon, which was a Philistine city, and they've just begun to excavate that, and that's quite recent. And for the first time, they've found a graveyard of Philistines just outside the city. For the first time, this is new. And then you've got another place called Magdala, which is the home of Mary Magdalene. And they've been digging up stuff there. They've found 2 temples, one on top of the other. And then finally you've got Ephesus. And remember when Paul was in Ephesus, he called a riot because the local people, they worshipped Artemis, which was a goddess, and they were making a lot of money out of idols, and Paul was sort of upsetting the idol trade. And so it talks about where they had the right and all that sort of thing. So get information. They've found the amphitheatre where it was, and so these things are happening all the time, which give us more and more background to what's going on. So look forward to seeing more things coming up, with the technology. Now, the first thing I want to look at is starting with the actual archaeology. And I'm only going to scratch the surface today, excuse the pun, but one of the things that comes up right at the very beginning is the question of monotheism or polytheism, which one was first, right? Now, of course, one of the problems with evolutionists, they like to sort of say, well, everything evolved. They take the theory outside its biological context, and they say, well, everything has evolved. And of course, they say that polytheism started first, and then eventually became monotheism. Now, the evidence is the other way around, and what we find is when we look at primitive people, the very primitive people, which are not affected so much by outside influences, monotheism was there at the beginning. And what's happened is that monotheism has become corrupted into polytheism. And for example, in particular, if we look at some of the primitive tribes throughout the world, particularly if they're highly isolated, for example, on Madagascar, in desert regions like the African Bushmen and the Australian Aborigines, and living in an hospitable climate, Eskimos and other Arctic people. Now, the Australian Aborigines have probably the simplest culture of any people known, yet they have amazing religious conceptions. For example, God is all-knowing, lives in the heavens, is maker and Lord of all things, rewards the good conduct of people, and by his lessons softens the heart. In some cases there are other gods, but generally there's a supreme god, like in the Maori. There's Atua, and then there's various Tane and various other ones, but there is a central high god, if you like. Why is this so? When you'd think that normally when people would start with, there's a god of this and a god of that, why should monotheism be there right at the very beginning? And so this is the question is raised is how much of the early chapters then is mythological rather than historical? And I'm not going to debate this, that's for another talk sometime. But some have tried to argue that the Genesis creation story arose out of earlier mythical versions, such as the Babylonian and Sumerian creation stories found in the ancient Near East. And all these accounts are quite fanciful. It's like, one god splitting in two and forming something or other. But what we find in the Genesis story is it's a very simple story, and there's no embellishment. It's monotheistic, and it suggests that the other ones are corruptions. Now, what's helped this is to find some early tablets in a place called Ebla, I should say. Ebla, there was a big mound, and this was a settlement in northern Syria, and it was about 3,500 BC, so that's a long time ago. That's before I was born. Which developed into a major, highly developed, thriving trade centre. Got to slow down, George. I've got to compress my natural gas a bit more. In excavating a 50-foot mound, they came across a palace containing one of the oldest archives and libraries of clay tablets ever found. And in particular, on the right there's the Ibla. What's happened here? Oh no, that's the next picture. I'm sorry, I keep getting the next picture in advance. So I've got two pictures here. We'll move on to the next one, which actually, those are the Ebla tablets. You can see some of them are quite small and some of them quite large. And there's a huge number of them, thousands of them. And they're mostly about sort of local things. But the thing about them is that they deal with things like judicial proceedings, and they reflect the same sort of things that were around when Moses was around. In other words, Moses wasn't all that different in having a legal understanding. And his legal ability is not out of place when we think of the existence of the Mosaic law code. It also mentions ancient cities like Sodom and Gomorrah. That was among the 5 cities of the plain. And also some of the pagan gods mentioned in the Bible as Baal. It mentions the Hittites, when in the past it was argued they did not exist so early. There are treaties and covenants similar to those in Exodus, and for the protection of society there are laws that point towards the concept of justice so prominent in Exodus. There are ritualistic sacrifices long before those of Leviticus, and also before the Canaanites, from which some critics claim the Hebrews borrowed them. But the ethics, the morality, and the spiritual values in the Pentateuch were superior. They have something extra, perhaps the hand of God. And so we find these tablets are referred to names found in the book of Genesis, including Adam, Eve, and Noah, though there is some debate about that. And it also contains the oldest creation accounts outside the Bible. The Ebler's version predates the Babylonian account by some 600 years. So this is fairly new compared with what's been known in the past. I've just read a little bit from it. This is the creation tablet. It's strikingly close to that of Genesis, speaking of one being who created the heavens, moon, stars, and earth. And the tablets report belief in creation from nothing, declaring, Lord of heaven and earth. The earth was not, you created it. The light of day was not, you created it. The morning light, you had not yet made it exist. And that's one of the archives. And so that's interesting, and that's very, very early. Another one which is quite early is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now this is a mythical type of story dating from about 2100 BC, so it's still quite early. But it has some sort of parallels with the Genesis story, and there's a flood story there too, suggesting a common ancient source. Now, a lot of these things we can debate them, the Genesis, the flood, and all the rest, but that's not part of this talk. Anyway, that's very interesting. What it indicates is that monotheism began before polytheism, and there's some very early evidence which shows that. Okay, let's get into some crumbly ash. We're going to look at Sodom and Gomorrah now, which is a fascinating one. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and there you've got layers of crumbly ash. And these, the ruins which go with these have been discovered near the Dead Sea. There are 5 cities of the plain, and they stand out from the surrounding terrain because of the white ash contained within them. So when you get the next picture will be an aerial view, and you'll see sort of white. Now what happened was that both places, Sodom and Gomorrah, were destroyed at the same time by an enormous catastrophe, conflagration. The destruction debris was about 3 foot thick, and the buildings were burnt by a fire that started on the roof, came down from on high, and the cities were founded on a fault line. And in the area there was sort of bitumen and petroleum in the area, along with natural gas and sulphur, which normally accompany a bitumen and petroleum. And what happened is that they were sitting on a time bomb. And when there was an earthquake, it caused pressure, so that the subterranean petroleum would be forced out and ignited. And so when Abraham looked down on the scene, he observed smoke rising out of the plain like smoke from a furnace. And so what we've got now is solid archaeological evidence that something happened to the cities of the plain. Now you read in Genesis 19:24, then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. And it would be like that. It was coming down, it come up and then caught fire and then came down. And it turned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them example to those who afterward would live ungodly. And so if we look at the cities of the plain, sorry, I didn't want to move. A little bit of brute force, that fixes most things, doesn't it? Okay, there on the left you see the 5 cities. And you can see that this is an aerial photograph, and you can see the white patches where they are. It shows you, and see how close it is to the Dead Sea, which is that dark, very dark blue patch in the middle there. So they're virtually right on the Dead Sea. And on the right here you have an example of a local shot where you've got buildings and things covered with all this stuff. What's interesting is the brimstone itself. Now the brimstone is a particular kind, and it's the first time in modern history we've found round balls of brimstone or nearly pure sulphur. and it's buried in the Dead Sea area. And on the left is brimstone with a burnt, hardened shell, but inside there's unburnt sulphur. In other words, the outside is all burnt, and next to it is a brimstone without a burnt shell. So they look quite different. The one on the left looks as though somebody's stood on it, and the one on the right, it looks as though it's off the top of a Christmas cake. Anyway, the photo on the right it's got unburnt sulphur inside, and there are tiny crystals on the surface, which happens when the sulphur is burning in a liquid state, and then it got burnt out and it formed crystals afterwards. Now the brimstone has something like 98% sulphur with some trace amounts of magnesium, and these create a very high temperature burn, so it's very hot. And apparently this is the only place on Earth where you can find 96% pure monoclinic sulphur in a round ball. This brimstone is not from any type of geothermal activity, as there's no evidence of such in the area. And ordinary geothermal sulphur nodules, like perhaps what you might get at Rotorua, they're only 40% pure sulphur, and they're of a different shape, a rhombus. If you know what a rhombus is, it's a rectangle pushed over. Anyway, that's by the way. We now change tack, and we're going to look at a thing called a Moabite stone. It was discovered in 1868, and it's now in the Louvre, and records the defeat of Omri, king of Israel, whose God was Yahweh, by Mesha, king of Moab. It's dark coloured. It's about 4 foot by 2 foot. All these measurements, I'm afraid, are American, so they're all feet and inches. So it was a reasonable size, 4 foot. And it bears one of the earliest extra-biblical reference to Yahweh. Okay, so it's mentioned there. And there's a French scholar called André de Mer. He reconstructed a portion. If his reconstruction is right about the translation, it also mentions the house of David, the earliest mention of the house of David. And there are 4 of these altogether. They're called steles, S-T-E-L-E-S. They represent these sort of inscribed stones, which mention Israel. So, as I say, there are 3 others of those. Moving on, we're going to look at now what I call Joab's grand entrance. I don't know how you like being down that far down the ground, but what happened was that this is a shaft called Warren's Shaft. He discovered it in 1867. Notice how recent all these discoveries are, and there's more going to come. It was named after him, and it provided the Jerusalem with access to a Gihon spring, which lay outside the city's protective wall. And it suggests the irregular dimensions of it was not man-made, but it was basically naturally occurring, sort of a sinkhole or an erosion shaft caused by water percolating through the dolomite. And David was taunted by the Jebusites who were in Jerusalem and issued a challenge in 2 Samuel, where he said basically whoever climbed the shaft and smote the inhabitants first would be made chief. And Joab did that. And it must have been quite a feat getting up there without a ladder. I don't know how he did it. It's very easy to see on TV, they all do it there, don't they? But anyway, so that was interesting to see where the shaft was. You look at the map. They were able to come in from the valley, go up the shaft, along, and then come out several places inside Jerusalem and capture Jerusalem. So that was the what I call Joab's grand entrance. And then we've got another one which is related to that, Hezekiah's tunnel. And this is a water tunnel that was dug underneath the city of David in Jerusalem. It comes from the reign of King Hezekiah. And it corresponds to some waterworks mentioned in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And in 701 BC, Hezekiah prepared Jerusalem for a siege by the Assyrians. The Assyrians were on the march then. And what they were going to do is try and block the source of waters of the Upper Gihon and send it straight down to the city of David. So they had a water supply. So when they were sieged, they had access to water. It's expressed in 2 Chronicles 32. The curving tunnel is 533 metres long, and there's only a 30 centimetre altitude difference between the two ends. How they got it right, I don't know. It's what they call a 0.6% gradient. And the engineers managed to get the water from the spring to the pool. And apparently they dug from both ends and met in the middle, which was quite a feat in those days. I don't know whether they still do that these days, but apparently they do. We've got lasers and things, but they just managed to do it by sort of tapping, you know. Are you there? Yes. Down a bit. And so they built this amazing tunnel. And there's an inscription called a Siloam inscription, which speaks about the two teams working from each end. Now the Bible has something like about 40 names of kings and things, all in the right historical order. And there are a couple of them, oops, that's okay, a couple of them which are worth mentioning. There's Sargon II, 722 to 702 BC, 705 BC, and he was a ruler of the Assyrian Empire. And he appears to have seized the throne from his brother Shalmaneser V in a violent coup. Now Sargon was already middle-aged when he came to the throne, and he was assisted by his son Sennacherib. And under his rule, the Assyrians completed the defeat of the Kingdom of Israel. It's interesting in Psalms, David says, I think it's Psalm 10, he says that Assyrian was the rod of God's anger. In other words, God used Assyria to bring judgment on Israel. And of course then later God judged Assyria as well. So at this stage we find that the Assyrians had completed the defeat of the Kingdom of Israel, and they'd captured Samaria after a 3-year siege and exiled the inhabitants. And these people were brought to Samaria, the Samaritans. Sargon's name actually appears in the Bible only once. There's an example of a throwaway line, and there we've got evidence of who he was in Isaiah 20 verse 1. Now Sennacherib, he followed in his father's footsteps. He was a monarch who ruled over the ancient Assyrian Empire for 25 years. His name is found 13 times in the Old Testament. And most notably is mentioned in the Bible in connection with the invasion of Syria and Palestine in 701. And he came west to put down a revolt in Phoenicia, then in Judah, over which Hezekiah reigned. Now what happened was his army surrounded Jerusalem. You may be familiar with the story. The king himself, that's Sennacherib, he was elsewhere, a place called Lachish, I think it is. And that's called, had some interesting archaeological discoveries recently. Some 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And how did this happen? How did he actually surround and try to get in? Well, there's a biblical record that says that he did not capture Jerusalem. And interesting enough, Sennacherib was known to boast of his victories. But regarding Jerusalem, he was silent. Something happened which was not very helpful. What happened is Hezekiah, one of Judah's better kings, he'd been seriously intimidated by the threat, because the Assyrians were pretty ruthless. I mean, they're the ones that invented crucifixion, and they did some pretty terrible things. And that's why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh in Assyria and didn't want them to repent. Anyway, this by the way. And he was... That's right. And so what happened, because he was scared, he paid the Assyrian ruler 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. This doesn't sound much, but apparently this is equivalent to 11 tons of silver and a ton of gold. And this was stripped from the sacred temple in the king's palace. However, eventually, Hezekiah finally decided to appeal to God in prayer. Isn't it tragic that sometimes, often, we consult God at the last resort? And this was an example of it. So he approached Isaiah and asked him to petition Yahweh on behalf of the remnant of his people. And the Lord's answer by means of his prophet was that the Syrian king would not prevail. That's in 2 Kings. And with stunning brevity, which reflects the restraint of divine inspiration, the Old Testament writer records how the Lord God dealt with pagan army. And it came to pass that night that the angel of Jehovah went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000, and when the men arose in the morning, behold, they were all dead bodies. And of course Sennacherib had been arrogantly blaspheming against Jehovah, and that was answered. And there appears to be a distorted recollection of the event 2 centuries later. The Greek historian Herodotus records the rumour of a massive destruction of Sennacherib's army at the entrance to Egypt. He depicted it as a plague of field mice that chewed up the Assyrians' leather bowstrings, quivers, and shield straps. Boy, they must have teeth on them. Interestingly, he attributed the destruction to divine intervention, a lack of reverence for the gods, and that's in the histories. And a guy called Professor Ridderbos noted, in this story we find the garbled reminiscence of the disaster that struck Sennacherib's army. And there's a verse in Scripture that says here, "Be not afraid of the words you have heard." This is Sennacherib's threat, "by which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will put spirit in him, and he'll hear news, and shall return to his own land, and I'll cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." In other words, there was a destruction, and this happened 20 years later. So Sennacherib, this is in 2 Kings, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt in Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshipping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adremelech and Sharezer, 2 sons, smote him with the sword, and they escaped in the land of Ararat. And Jehoiakim his son reigned in his stead. So, as I say, he took God on and lost. Then we find, we're now going to shift now to, we're getting closer to the New Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And some of you probably know about the story here, but what happened was that at the time, the worship in the Jewish temple seemed to be at a very low ebb and little hope for reform. And there were a group of devoted Jews that removed themselves from the mainstream, and they began a sort of monastic life in the Judean Bethesda. And their studies of the Old Testament led them to believe that God's judgment upon Israel was pretty close, that the Anointed One would return to restore the nation of Israel and purify their worship. And anticipating these moments, a group called the Essenes treated in the Qumran desert to await the return of their Messiah. And this community, which began in the 3rd century BC, devoted their days to the study and copying of sacred scripture, as well as theological and sectarian works. And as the tension between the Jews and the Romans increased, the community hid their valuable scrolls in caves along the Dead Sea to protect them from invading armies, in the hope that one day the scrolls would be retrieved and restored to the nation of Israel. Of course, we know that in AD 70, the Roman general Titus invaded Israel and destroyed the city of Jerusalem along with its treasured temple. It was at this time that the Qumran community was overrun and occupied by the Roman army. And so the scrolls remain hidden for the next 2,000 years. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad, interesting, was searching for his lost goat. He had lost any goats lately? And he came upon a small opening of a cave. And thinking his goat had fallen into the cave, he threw some rocks in the opening, hoping to hear a bleat of a startled goat, and instead he heard the shattering of clay pottery. So he lowered himself into the cave and he discovered several sealed, on the right there's one, a cave, several sealed jars, clay pottery, and when he opened one, he found that it contained leather scrolls, so he's a bit disappointed in that. So he got 7 of them, the best ones, left the other fragments on the ground, and then he took some of these scrolls to a cobbler and an antique dealer in Bethlehem named Kundo, thinking the scrolls were written in Syriac, brought them to a Syrian Orthodox archbishop, who recognised that the scrolls were written in Hebrew and suspected they were very ancient and valuable. So he eventually had the scrolls examined. And after the initial discovery, the archaeologists found other caves between 952 and 956. Found 10 other caves that contained thousands of ancient documents as well. One of the greatest treasures of the ancient manuscripts has been discovered, the so-called Dead Sea Scrolls. And of course the Hebrew Bible was meticulously standardized and copied by a group of Jews called the Masoretes. Some of you may know about them in the 8th and 9th centuries, giving us the Masoretic text. They used the best possible documents, and because of their extreme reverence for the scripture, they strive to preserve document purity as much as possible, using all kinds of detailed checks. In other words, if the middle letter of a book was not the same as it should be, the whole book was scrapped. You know, the meticulous care they dealt with to make sure that these things were copied accurately, and then when they were copied, the old ones were then got rid of. It's not a very promising start to looking for early manuscripts. And so there's a huge gap of something like from between 1400 and 2300 BC. And the earliest existing copy of the Masoretic text was AD 900. But what's interesting is that when looking at these Old Testament books that are 1,000 years earlier, right, they've found that it's highly accurate, and they've got different ways of checking. They've got carbon-14 dating, you've got paleography, which is looking at ancient writing forms, orthography, which is spelling and archaeology. And they're able to check up how much change had been going on since that time. And from the 40,000 inscribed fragments recovered, over 500 books have been identified, with 100 of these being copies of the 39 books of the Old Testament. The only one that's missing is Esther. Much of this material predates the community. Anyway, that's by the way. So accurate was the copying was that in regard to Isaiah's scroll, for example, there were only 13 minor changes in the Revised Standard Version of the Bible in 1952 as a result. So by comparing the standard Hebrew Old Testament used today with the Dead Sea Scrolls, a well-known theologian called Gleason Archer, who's very much into archaeology and stuff like that, in 1994, he found that the two copies of Isaiah proved to be word for word identical in more than 95% of the text. The 5% variation consisted chiefly of obvious slips of the pen and variations in spelling. That's amazing, over 1,000 years. And if the text has changed so little in its second 1,000 years, then we have confidence it changed very little in the first 1,000 years. There's also no gap between scroll 39 and 40. There's always been a debate about being two Isaiahs, but there's no gap in here, and it's a single book. That's important, you see, because if they say that the second is later, then there's a question of were these predictions before or after? And so if you can date it at the right time, then these were definitely predictions before and not after. And of course there are other versions, as well as the Masoretic tradition. They also looked at the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation, and the Samaritan Jewish Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. And they're able to, there's also some Dead Sea Scrolls about these. So other checks as well, which I won't go into. I better keep an eye on my time, otherwise I'm going to go on and everybody will be asleep when I get to the end. Okay, there's so much that you can cover. I mean, you have to be selective. What I want to do now is move into the New Testament. Now, the thing about the New Testament, of course, is that we're not going to the existence of Jesus because there's plenty of evidence, and that's another whole talk about the external evidence from Josephus and Tacitus and all Pliny and all the other guys. We're not trying to prove anything, right? The whole point is we don't use archaeology to prove the validity of the Bible. All we're saying is that it supports the historical accounts, the dates, the people, which gives us some reason to believe that the Bible is historical record as well as involving spiritual history. Because the Bible is about spiritual history. It's about God interacting with people. And you'll find at times the Bible skates over long periods and there's been a lot of time in a short period. Like the story of Joseph, for example. And in Genesis and later on. And of course, in the New Testament, you've got most of the time spent on just Jesus' life. So it's the spiritual significance of the history that is important. Anyway, I mustn't sidetrack. First one to look at is the pools of Bethesda. Now in John 5, Jesus heals a man at the pool of Bethesda. And John describes a pool, they're actually twin pools, having 5 porticos, because nobody believed this was true. And when Jesus heals a paralytic in the Gospel of John, the Bethesda pool is described as having 5 porticos, because it means it's sort of perhaps an unusual 5-sided pool. We don't have 5-sided bathtubs these days, for example. So it's not surprising that people wonder.
No. Okay.
However, when this site was excavated, it revealed a rectangular pool with 2 basins separated by a wall. That's a 5-sided pool, and each side had a portico. And this site had been long in dispute until recently. It's 40 foot underground. You can see it right down there. 2 pictures of it. Both these are off the internet. The same picture, look different, but you can locate the same archway in both of them. One's bigger than the other. And so it matches John's description. Then there's, of course, Bethesda itself, and this is particularly interesting to me. because it shows you 5 levels of architecture. You've got, first of all, right at the bottom, the very lowest level, right at the front there, is actually a temple. And then we go up to Roman part of the city, and then we've got Byzantine in the centre, then we've got the Crusaders on the topmost level, and on top of that the modern level. So you can see what problems archaeologists have. They hit a site and they go down and they get different layers. And they've got to sort of sort it all out and date it and all the rest of it. So that just gives you an example of how complex it can be to get into an ancient site. Another pool is the pool of Siloam. And this is mentioned several times in the Bible, back in Isaiah 8:6, for example. And this is the location where Jesus sent a man who was born blind from birth to complete his healing. This is another long disputed site, discovered in 1897, began upholding the historicity of John's Gospel. Then we've got a Pilate stone, which is another interesting one. And now, not long ago, scholars were questioning his existence, Pilate. However, evidence he was governor, or what we call prefect, who presided over the trial of Jesus, was discovered in Caesarea Maritima. There's 2 cities of Caesarea. And in 1961, an Italian archaeologist named Antonio Frova uncovered a fragment of a plaque that was used as a section of steps leading to the Caesarea theatre. The inscription, written in Latin, contained the phrase, "Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated the people of Caesarea a temple in honour of Tiberius." So here the existence of Pilate in amongst that writing there, which is not too easily seen, but confirms that. And then Tacitus, a Roman historian of the 1st century, also confirms the New Testament designation of Pilate. Then of course you've got the crucifixion story, and this is an interesting one because scholars used to think that the Romans used ropes and not nails to secure victims to the cross. And it was thought that such victims were only thrown into common graves and not given proper burials. But in 1968, getting nearer, Vasilius Severus found an ossuary, and an ossuary is a collection of bones in a box. Ossuary. We'll all be an ossuary one day. Sorry, let's be careful. Containing the bones of Johanan ben Hagelgol in northern Jerusalem. It contained a tomb with 35 other bodies. And he was killed by crucifixion sometime between AD 70 and 7 and 70, which covers the period of Jesus. And apparently he still had a 7-inch nail in his right heel, and his legs were broken. It's described in John 19, 32 to 33. Apparently the nail in his right heel had a knot in the wood of the cross and could not be removed from the ankle when attempting to remove Johanan from the cross. So to get him off the cross, they had to remove part of the cross itself. So there's the nail. They also found other things. He was crucified in a manner resembling the crucifixion of Jesus. 7-inch nail had been driven through both feet, in which turned outwards so the nail could be hammered inside the Achilles tendon. They also found that nails had been driven through his lower forearms. As we know, a victim of crucifixion would have to raise and lower his body in order to breathe, and eventually he wouldn't be able to do that, and then he would and not get his breath. And Johann's other arms were smoothly worn, indicating this movement. And John records that in order to expedite the death of a prisoner, executioners broke the legs of the victim so he could not lift himself up by pushing with his feet. Johann's legs were found to be crushed by a blow, breaking them both below the knee. So also to relating to crucifixion, 1878, a stone slab was found in Nazareth with a decree from Emperor Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54 AD, again very close to the time. It was stated that graves must not be disturbed, nor were bodies to be removed. The punishment on other degrees is a fine. For this one threatens death and comes very close to the time of the resurrection. So there's again extraneous evidence which we can bring in, which supports the actual facts of the time. And then of course Luke is well known as a historian. And I've just got one verse here, well, two verses, Luke 3, 1 to 2, where you've got 16 things that can be checked. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene, and the priesthood of Ananias and Sapphirus. 6 things that can be checked. 16, sorry, thank you. 16 things, all of which have been checked out to be true. Interestingly enough, Luke names 32 countries, 54 cities and 9 islands without error. A guy called A.N. Sherwin White, he's a very well-known archaeologist and ancient historian, said that for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. And so, as I say, Luke not only lists numbers, and why should, if you were writing a fictional story, why would you bother with all of this? Because Luke wanted to present to this guy Theophilus a story of what happened, and he wanted to do it accurately. And so we've got all these extra things as well that can be checked up on. For example, he mentioned that in Thessalonica there were politarchs, in Ephesus there were temple wardens, in Cyprus there was a proconsul, and Malta was a guy called the first man of the island. And he got all these right. I won't go into the rest of that. There are a few other things there like that, but what I want to look at now is Synagogue in Capernaum. Now I think at one stage they didn't believe there was one there because Jesus went into the synagogue, but they've now found it. It's located on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. It had a population of about 1,500. And they found 2 ancient synagogues there, and a house turned into a church by the Byzantines is said to be the home of St. Peter. So that's very interesting. Finally, this is my final one, and I've got other ones floating around which might come up in discussion. We're going to look now at Jacob's well. Remember, with Jacob's well, Jesus talked to the woman of Samaria, and remember, he seemed to know all about her, knew she'd had a husband, and the man she was living with was not her husband, and told her that basically that he was the Messiah, and revealed himself to her, and she went back and talked to her villagers, and they came on board as well. And so that still exists, but now of course it's low down, it's in the basement. Everything gets built on top of everything else, and it's called a little bit ornate and has a building around it now. That apparently is the original Jacob's well at Sychar, and Jesus is said to meet the Samaritan woman. Well, that's a gallop through. But what I'm trying to get across is that archaeology is not just about confirming individual things in the Bible. It's about supporting evidence for the surrounding cultures, and what you see in the Bible is similar to what's happening in the surrounding cultures. It's particularly true of the Old Testament. And so things are going to keep coming up all the time. There's new stuff going on all the time, and these days they're able to get into sites. They can do aerial photography, they can do 3-dimensional pictures and that without disturbing anything. Because once you disturb a site, you've lost it. So it's going to be very fascinating. And I just tacked in one at the last minute here, which was, I thought I might mention, I haven't got a picture for it, about the walls of Jericho. And how many know about the walls of Jericho? We'll come across the archaeology about that. Because Jericho is a very ancient city. It's been built on many times. And at one stage they thought the date was wrong. That when it was destroyed, it couldn't have possibly been at the time when Joshua and the people of children of Israel marched around the wall. But the interesting thing is that that we find that there are 4 prominent archaeologists. They've excavated the site from 907 to 1909, then the 1930s, then 1952 to 1958, and then currently a guy called Brian Wood. And the result of their work's been quite remarkable. First, Jericho had a massive system of fortifications. There were several levels of walls. Surrounding the city was a retaining wall 15 foot high, and at its top was an 8-foot brick wall, strengthened from behind by an earthen rampart. And there were domestic structures found behind the first wall, and another brick wall enclosed the rest of the city. So it's not an easy place to get into. And this is consistent with Joshua's description of Rahab's quarters. Remember, Rahab was the harlot who actually helped them to get into the city. This is Joshua 2:15. And archaeologists also found that in one part of the city, large piles of bricks were found at the base of both the inner and outer walls, indicating a sudden collapse of the fortifications. Scholars feel that an earthquake, which may also explain the damming of the Jordan in the biblical account, caused this collapse. The collapsed bricks formed a ramp by which the invader may have easily entered the city. And one of the people working on the site says, it's the main fact then, there remains no doubt, the walls filled outward so completely the attackers were able to clamber up and over the ruins of the city. It's remarkable that when attacked city walls fall inward, not outward. And of course this was debated a long time. The city was also destroyed by fire in Joshua 6:24, and they've also found evidence of blackened stuff and burnt bricks, and there's a whole lot of other stuff too I've got here, I won't go into it, but this is still ongoing, and at one stage they thought the date was wrong, but now they've actually found some very early stuff. I'm just looking down here. They've got a piece of charcoal found in the debris dated to be 1410 BC. This evidence leads Wood to the conclusion that pottery, stratigraphic considerations, scarab data, and a carbon 14 date all point to a destruction of the city around the end of the late Bronze Age, about 14 BC, which is the 1400 BC, which is the time when it happened. So it's now been confirmed that that is the right date. So I'll stop there. I thought I'd throw that one in at the end because we're only just starting, right? And look out for things that come up. And the website is a good place to find it. I mean, I've always been a little bit interested in this in apologetics, but just lately I've been doing all this on the internet, and there's a lot there. There's a lot there. You can look up for yourself. You'll get differences of opinion depending on a person's worldview, but there are certain things, the ones I've mentioned today, I feel are fairly conclusive. So I'll stop there, and maybe you might want to discuss some things or questions or whatever. Yes?
What about the recent archaeological find in Greece of the giants?
Oh, apparently that picture's a fake. I saw that one because someone put it to me. They were probably talking about what's happened in Genesis 2, was it? The Nephilim and the giants, and apparently they showed a picture with or without the giant. Because I wondered about that too, and I had a look at it, and it seemed to be it was a fake. Sorry.
George, we were in Israel last year, and when you go to Jericho, you have to have a local guide, a Palestinian guide, and they're still telling the other story that the date is wrong, and it's the Bible hasn't been verified. That's the story they're telling you. So I'm just telling you that. So there's people are trying to use propaganda through this information.
This will always happen one a day. Yeah. Depends on which side of the fence you're on. Yeah. Thanks, Paul.
So I just have a general kind of question. It's basic to us on this. If the big exodus out of Egypt happened, why was there no record in Egyptian things at the time? And also, when Jesus was crucified, was said that people were rising from the grave.
Yes.
The event.
The temple was split into the
why
temple.
Why was there, outside of the Bible, why was there no historical record of it? Because just things that I'm getting from non-Christian people as well. If it was such a big event, why did nobody else report it? Because there was other things reported.
Ask Dad to give me a pen, my
Well, that's true. It's true, and I think that this is what's happened all the way along. People said there's no evidence, and then eventually something happens.
Yeah.
But there, of course, there are other evidence as well, and I can give you 16 evidences for the resurrection and some statistics, which are based on other facts. So there are some difficulties.
Well,
what does that mean when the saints
like
come out of their graves and walked around?
Yeah.
So We don't know that one.
Yeah.
Can I throw some light on that question?
Yes, John.
Yeah.
Apparently there's an Ahmose stela which is in the Cairo Museum, which they won't allow people to go and look at, and that is apparently a very ancient thing which describes the Exodus. But when the Egyptians were recording it, they didn't want to say that the Israelites had got away, so they called it they were expelled, and so the account is of what's called the Hyksos expulsion, and they didn't. So that's the answer to that one.
Yeah.
The Egyptians didn't want to say that the Israelites, with the help of God, got out of the country, so they said we expelled them.
Yes, and I think this is part of the problem, isn't it, with trying to understand, like the business with Sennacherib, where he didn't want to say that he didn't capture the city, but went home with his tail between his legs, Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah. Any other stories? Or?
Yeah, I just want to get your thoughts on, there's a new theory that's on the Temple Mount, the actual Temple Mount. There's a new theory by a guy by the name of Bob Koenig that says that Temple Mount is actually the old Roman fort, and it's not actually the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and that the site of the Temple Mount is slightly lower than that on the mountain. What are your thoughts on that?
I've not heard about that one, but this is of course where you'll get controversy, and this will go on, and it's like whenever people write about the life of Jesus, there are many people who have different versions and various claims about how the resurrection might have taken place, of swing theory, all those sort of things. And there are always going to be people who will come up with alternative theories. In some respects, you can't prove that they're wrong, but they can't prove that they're right. So often we're in a state of let's wait and see, and maybe some more excavation will clarify that. Does it alter anything? That's the point in the Bible, if it's not quite the right place. It's like where they found Mount Sinai in a different place, What it did was it put people off from trying to find where the crossing of the Red Sea was. They were looking in the wrong place. So they didn't find anything. And I think that's going to be the case. If we believe that the Bible was inspired by God, He will somehow or other protect the Bible in the future, and we will find things which will confirm. And it seems to be so far everything has been confirmed. There's a Jewish archaeologist called Dr. Gluick, who basically says that he's used the Bible to find thousands of things. He's a well-known Jewish archaeologist, and he's been able to use that as textbook to find things. So that in itself sort of tells something about the validity of the material that's out there. Yeah. There are some difficulties like the Tower of Babel and the flood. Was it local or was it worldwide? And the book of Genesis, well, in my apologetics book, I've got 7 versions of the book of Genesis, how you interpret it. There's always going to be different interpretations. Fortunately, they're not relevant to becoming Christian. The thing I always say to people, look, if you believe in evolution or not, doesn't matter. It's being a Christian that counts. Having the same Lord and Master, even if we have different views. And so often in churches we get hung up on some things which are not actually fundamental to Christianity. But we can still debate them and disagree with each other. That's fine. Let's do it though in Christian love. And that's what I always try and say when I'm involved with apologetics, what I have been for the last few years.
Excuse me, I just wanted to ask, I believe that there's some controversy about the number of people that left Egypt.
Yes, I remember reading that.
In Exodus, that the actual biblical number seems impossible because it would take them hours and hours and hours and
Millions.
hours
A couple of millions.
to get through the sea. I think it's 6,000 or some 6,000. But anyway, do you know anything about
Well, there are some problems with some Bible numbers, and occasionally you'll get differences when you look at the Book of Kings and Chronicles, because they repeat on incidents that happened. I think at one stage it got 4,000 instead of 400 chariots. And there are obviously going to be some small things like that where there are disagreements. And so there's always going to be problems with numbers, I think, in the Bible. It's like the number 40 is basically a a time of trial. So you'll find that Moses spent 3 lots of 40 years in his life, and you've got 40 years Jesus in the wilderness. And it's like 3 days, rise in 3 days. It's kind of a phrase like, for example, I'll see you in a minute, or just wait a second. It's kind of a colloquial phrase. And the 3 days you'll find sometimes refers to 3 whole days, 3 days and 3 nights, or on the 3rd day. It's a passage of time, about 3 days. And so you'll find that when it comes to numbers in the Bible, there are some problems in taking them for granted. But as a general rule, they seem to be accurate to the time. But there are differences. I've mentioned one of them, as I say, that was and I think one stage there where they got a date wrong, and I think it was a son and his king. I think the son was older than the king because of the way you date it. And so these numbers that could have slipped in, mistakes could slip in that, but they don't make any difference to the actual text itself. So I don't know about that one. And you're quite right. I think it's been mentioned, you know, that there's a pretty large population, a couple of million, I believe. And you've got to cross this, how many kilometres or so it was across? But
yeah, well, they said it was going to be like 10 by 10 kilometres of people or something, which seems sort of impossible to walk together, you know, and maybe more than would have been around at the time. So, yeah.
There's a lot of people. I don't know what the population of the place in Egypt where Joseph was ruler. But there are questions like that, which I think, I mean, we have to face it that there are going to be some things. I mean, we know, for example, in the New Testament that not everything agrees, like the number of angels and that sort of thing. And some people say there's 2 or there's 1. But the point is this: that it's looking at the general tenor to see what's right. One of the things you see, which is a problem in those days with the Bible, 2 things. First of all, they learned everything by rote. They had very good memories, and you know, like there'd be people who would memorize the whole of the Torah, and that was the way they did things in those days. And some still do. I mean, in Islam, there are those who memorize the whole of the Quran in classical Arabic. Whether they understand it or not, that's another matter. But the point is that there were skills in those days for remembering things, and they were trained. The Jews were trained to be good at memory. And so, I started off somewhere, I've ended somewhere else now. Don't grow old. This happens regularly. Sorry, I better stop there before I ramble on, but I hope that helps a little bit.
One explanation I've seen on the numbers that seems quite reasonable to me, because they found the same sort of problem looking at, say, Egyptian records, where there seems to be millions of soldiers, and eventually they figured out that the way they were recording it was that the thousands referred to those who were the high-ranking soldiers, and then the smaller numbers were the lower ranks. So they were actually ranking people, but just by saying the millions are these people, and the thousands are these, and tens of thousands means the chariot leaders. And so if you look at the Exodus numbers and say that maybe this is a count, when it says thousands, that means one person of fighting age. And then the numbers all sort of make a lot more sense, and that's consistent with what other ways of recording numbers were being done by other peoples around the time. Now, I'm not saying that's true, but it works for me.
It's like some people say, you know, we have a number system, 1, 2, and many.
Oh.
You know? Yes.
I've just Googled that. I've got it right in front of me. It says the men armed for war, 603,550, but all included with women and children, blah, blah, it's 2.5 million in the Exodus.
Right.
Excuse me, isn't it true that the Jews had no numerals, and that when they were writing things down, they used letters?
Yes, same in Greek.
Yeah.
The letters are both the numbers and the actual letters. And of course in Hebrew there are no vowels, and often no punctuation. And you go from right to left. And of course it's a sort of language which is like Yahweh, what is it, YHWH is it? And the bits we put in our own interpretation of Yahweh. And so there are some interesting questions about numerology, and this is another whole track again, relating to both Greek and Hebrew. But you're quite right, it's, I don't know how they, I mean, the Roman system was terrible, isn't it? You know, XLVV, XLCXLVIII. You know, like Roman soldiers' number. I. You know, it's not a very good system. We thank the Arabs who helped with our mathematics and developed some of the things. Anyway, that's by the way. It's just a freebie. Yes,
George, are you familiar with a fairly recently published DVD rather called Patterns of Evidence?
No.
It's sort of moving away from Genesis. It's examining the Exodus, and it looks at the claims of many archaeologists and historians who basically say there is no evidence of the Israelis, not occupation, but of their presence in large numbers in Egypt. And so the DVD, it's a wonderful documentary, and it's made by a Christian guy who was a filmmaker, and he did it over about 10 years, and he did a lot of research, and essentially comes to the conclusion that that the archaeologists are simply looking in the wrong places at the wrong levels, and it's a very, very powerful presentation which affirms the historicity of Exodus, which is under attack in the secular world.
Yes, it is.
So it's available at creation.com if anyone wants to find it. That's cool.
And we will always be under attack, won't we? You know, it's the same with everything that's religious.
Yeah.
There'll always be those that want to try and attack it, and not always reasonably so.
Yeah. And so the other thing, of course, with the dating of the pharaohs,
Yes.
a lot of those dates are actually overlapping, and so the question is, you know, are the secular people correct in their dating of things that happened in Egypt?
Yes.
That's the Bible.
It's the same with the story of Joseph, you know, where does that fit in to the history, of course? Yeah. No, thank you for that.
That was actually this gentleman's been speaking about was actually a program on TV called Exodus Decoded. It's work by Simcha Jabakichi, and they showed that they're about the recent dating of the Exodus was 200 years wrong, and they also found that when they looked in the right place in Avaris on the eastern side of the delta, they found they were looking to see if they could find a signet ring of Joseph, and they actually apparently found 20 copies, not all complete, with Joseph's name in Hebrew, dating to just before the time of the about 200 years before the Exodus.
Okay, yeah. Amazing, because Joseph was an amazing person, really, because he was sort of second in command at the age of 30. How's that for promotion?
Another thing, George, in the patterns of evidence looking at Exodus, is that the archaeologists have now discovered somewhere up there in northeastern, somewhere up there in Egypt, near the Mediterranean, they've discovered 12 tombs, 11 of which are quite small, and the other one, which is a magnificent tomb, and the suggestion is that these may be the tombs of Joseph and his 11 brothers.
You've been trying for a while, I know, sorry. Yes.
And how you said about the evidence that they mentioned the flood?
Yes.
Don't they do that in like most of the religions around the Mediterranean have some mention of this large flood during the timeline of their...
Well, the Sumerians sort of, they date the time from the flood, before and after. And of course there's also stories of long living Sumerian kings which is interesting because we know in Genesis, we have some really ancient people living 900 years or so. It raises some interesting questions, which takes off on a tangent. But certainly they did use a flood, and there were obviously at least local floods, right? Because they found layers of silt, which suggests that there were local floods. But the question is, was there a bigger flood? And of course, we have a lot of division and discussion on that, and I don't want to go into that topic, but certainly, whether it's fundamental to the other ancient, I wouldn't know. But certainly with the Sumerian culture, I know that they said the kings before the flood and the kings after the flood. They used it as a kind of dividing line. So definitely something happened.
I guess that's what he's mentioning. I think it was in Mongolian or Chinese writings that there was also...
There are records outside, yes, in China, yes.
Indian Americans was writing about the big flood or the
flood. There are a lot of flood stories, yeah. That raises a lot of debates, which I think are interesting, but in a way, I think the key thing really about the flood is that God does judge sinfulness somehow or other. But anyway, we won't go down that track. Yes, hello.
The recent heavy shelling and bombing in Syria,
Yes.
is that of concern to your workers that might be more sites will be damaged or lost?
Yes, very much so.
Yes.
Because you see, the Ebla stones, tablets, were found in northern Syria. And of course, there's a lot of wonderful things in Syria. And it's very, very sad that this has been happening.
But ISIS is on purposely targeting these sites anyway.
Yes.
Yes. Destroying what
We want to take us back to the Dark Ages. Should have come to my talk in a fortnight back when we talked about understanding Islam, the role of jihad in Islam. Yeah. It's a major problem. Yeah. Anybody else? Have we covered everybody?
I know you sort of went into the gospel period, but the Turin shroud is very much held and guarded by the Roman Catholic Church. So
Yes.
is it sort of like a...
The same with relics. They have things called relics, which claim to be a piece of this and a piece of that. I wouldn't like to comment on that. I don't know enough about the shroud because I know there's a lot of discussion has been about it, and I'm not so sure how relevant it is. I mean, I think what's important is that when the Peter and John raced up to the tomb, and of course Peter being the impetuous one, he rushed in, and they saw the napkin around the head separate from the shroud. Why would that be so? Unless Jesus had risen, and the fact that who moved this very, very large boulder, which would have weighed 1 or 2 tons from the entrance to the, the shroud. Okay, it's an interesting scientific thing to discuss, but it doesn't really interest me. But some interest other people. So I don't think they're ever really going to know. I mean, we know it's fairly ancient, and they've done all sorts of imaging, and maybe with new technology, they might be able to find more things. I don't know. It's an interesting thing. It is interesting, I agree. Yeah. Well, are we all done, I think?